Hi, my name is Jennifer Lee, and I'm going to talk about how to survive the Colbert Report. So a couple years ago, I wrote a book on how Chinese food is all American, and basically it argues that a lot of the food that we think of as Chinese actually is alien to Chinese people, such General Tso's chicken, fortune cookies, and chop suey. So if you think about it, if our benchmark for Americanness is apple pie, how often do you eat apple pie versus how often do you eat Chinese food? So my publicist got me on this show called The Colbert Report, which I had never seen because since college, I never owned a TV, which makes me a bit of a freak, but very, very productive. So my friends were like, maybe you should watch The Colbert Report because it might not be what you expect. So I turned it on one day and there was a scene in the entry where an eagle comes in and like swoops and covers the entire screen. And I was like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? So I had this sort of tremendous sense of panic because I had no idea how to sort of handle that kind of interview. And luckily, I actually had a bunch of friends who were fans of the Colbert Report, and they told me to sort of calm down. One of them actually is named Alexis Ohanian, who's the founder of Reddit, and he spent a couple of months, like before the show, actually bombarding me with like little tips on how to handle Stephen Colbert. So one of the things that he actually sent was a piece of advice on the fact that if he actually said he ate apple pie every day, I could come back and say, well, there are exceptions, and clearly you are an exceptional American. So I actually then went to my other friends who were professionals, because the nice thing about living in New York City is you actually do have friends that kind of work on these shows. So Rachel here actually was a writer for the Daily Show, who I went to high school with, and then Mark worked on backstage at the Colbert Report, and he himself was a comedian. And Allison was actually the executive producer of the Colbert Report. She herself actually went to Hebrew school with my then boyfriend and sat in front of him. She's 6 feet tall, he's 5'7", so it was a little bit hard for him to see. So the thing to understand, they said, is to know that Stephen Colbert comes from an improv tradition. He cut his teeth at a place called Second City, which is in Chicago, and is like the Harvard of comedy troupes. So it's a lot of sort of famous and prominent comedians came from there. That's him and Stephen Carell. And the thing is, before Second City, a lot of the comedy was very slapstick, and Second City took a much more cerebral sort of style of comedy. So a lot of the famous comedians of this era actually have come through there. Mike Myers, Shelley Long, John Candy. The one actually in the upper left-hand corner is Tina Fey, and the blonde that's also in the top, that's actually Joan Rivers. So when you see sort of this entire panoply of people who've come through and the way that has shaped modern comedy, you sort of develop an understanding of what to do under Stephen Colbert. So the first tip that they actually gave me is the yes and rule, which is one of the fundamental rules of improv. And that means basically never deny. No matter how absurd your improv partner is, you always sort of build upon it. So it's like, we're trapped in an elevator. Yes. And we're running out of air. You don't say things like, no, and we're actually being chased by a tiger, because that dissipates the energy. So no matter how absurd Stephen Colbert is being, the idea is to sort of roll with it and just say yes. And so the other thing to do is that to understand you don't want to be funny, because it's his job to be funny. And in comedy, there's a straight man, sort of funny man dynamic. And as a result, what they often do is they don't like to let comedians onto the Colbert Show, except for there was one exception with Steve Martin, because Colbert himself was such a fan. So you can be witty, but the key thing is you shouldn't yourself try to be funny. The last thing they sort of told me was to trust your instinct. First thought, best thought. If you have a gut reaction, trust yourself to blurt it out. Don't try to second guess yourself, because then you just sort of end up stymieing your impulse to be sort of funny. So what is it like to go on a Colbert Report? So the first thing they do is, like, right before the show, they actually, Stephen Colbert comes down, and he is very nice. He's out of character. He's kind of cerebral, almost like a professor, and he tells you he's kind of in character. Like, if you've never seen it, he kind of warns you kind of what to predict and sort of expect. He actually has a sheet of questions that a lot of the writers kind of draw up for him. but he actually does or doesn't kind of draw from it depending on his improv tradition. So it turns out he actually did use the apple pie line. He said he eats apple pie every day while playing baseball. But thanks to Alexis Ohanian, I was totally prepared. And as a result, one of the nice things that Alexis got to do was kind of come to the rehearsal and the sort of taping. So that is how you survive Stephen Colbert. Thanks.